Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sigrid King. I'm the program director for undergraduate English, and I'm so excited and delighted to be here with you today to talk about an amazing research project that some of our students were engaged in. And the way we're going to do this is I'm going to give a brief overview that explains a little bit about what it was they were doing, why they were doing it, how it fits into a larger grant project. And then each student is going to come up and talk about the writer that they focused on for their research project. So let's go ahead and begin. All right, so these are the names of the students who will be presenting today. And I wanted to give a little bit of context for their work. Their work is actually part of a CIC Humanities for the Public Good grant that a group of faculty and staff started working on about 3 years ago. And then COVID occurred and it had to be shelved for a couple of years, but we were able to start it again this fall. The key research question is how the work of International Poetry Forum writers in the 1960s and 70s contributed to social change and helped reshape the country's understanding of what it means to be an engaged citizen. So in the fall, we set up the archive space, selected authors, started to identify relevant objects in the archive. And then in the spring, there was ongoing work with a large team of people preparing and installing a gallery exhibit that you can go to see in the University Commons right now. And Seamus Heaney display that's going to be in the Carnegie Library. We had Sam Hazo here as a speaker, and then of course, Scholars Day. The grant leadership team is the amazing Amy Bowman McElhone, who curated the exhibit, myself, the fabulous Allison Koenig, and the wonderful Ryan Scott. We had 4 terrific interns this year, Caitlin, who is here, KJ, and Caitlin with a K, who were unable to join us today, and Sarah, who was here in the last session, and many other contributors, Samuel Hazo, my class, students like Ali Pearl, staff like Sarah Zeffro, the whole library staff was wonderful, gallery interns and so on. So here are photographs of various stages. This is Caitlin right here in Sam Hazo's home, interviewing him. Her interview with him was used for 2 videos that are part of the gallery exhibit. This is what it looked like in the fall to be doing research in the archive space. All right, so what is the International Poetry Forum? It was a reading series founded and directed by Dr. Samuel Hazo. It was in Pittsburgh from 1966 to 2009. During that time, the series sponsored readings by over 800 poets and performers from over 36 countries. He founded this series to show the transformative power of the spoken word, particularly poetry, for all people, not just people in an academic environment. And you heard a lot of that in that last session, the critical point session, the power of the spoken word. The archives include photographs, programs, audio tape of those readers, video, articles, posters, and other amazing objects. How is this connected to Carlow's mission? Sam says, poetry introduces awe into our lives. Awe is the beginning of the wonder of wisdom, and wisdom inevitably returns us to our own humanity. Poetry uncovers meaning, creates empathy, and can serve as society's conscience. Many of the earliest IPF writers were advocates for social justice in the 60s and 70s. So what is archival research? It's something that most undergraduates typically don't get a chance to do. So the work that these students did was groundbreaking. They are the first scholars to ever use this archival material. And I'm just so impressed and proud of their work. So archives are permanently valuable records things like correspondence, recordings, art, manuscripts, and they're records of people and organizations. They're primary research sources rather than secondary sources, and the objects are one of a kind. So everything that's in the IPF archive, you can't find somewhere else. Most archives are focused on a topic or a theme. In this case, the International Poetry Forum's 43 years. And they have to be housed in climate-controlled conditions so that the materials don't deteriorate. And they're also protected and preserved through handling protocols. So you'll see our students here using gloves to handle the materials. You had to use pencils, and they learned how to do that so they can now do archival research at any archive in the world. They know how to do this. All right, so we're going to start with our presentations, and the first person who's going to talk about her poet is Emmy Long. Emmy, come on up.
Hi, so I'm Emmy Lang, and my poet was Adonis, born Ali Ahmad Said. And Said was born in 1930 in Al Kasabin, Syria, which is a rural farming village northwest of the capital of Damascus. He had no formal education until the age of 14, save for what his parents were reading him from the Quran. Otherwise, his days were spent helping with farm work. He grew up in a time of great political change that can be credited to Syria electing a new president. And he faced a year of imprisonment for his political actions before ultimately being exiled to Lebanon. And today he resides in France. In 1971, he left the Middle East for the first time to come read in Pittsburgh at the International Poetry Forum. And he returned in 1983 for another reading as well. His first book in English is The Blood of Adonis, which is translated by Samuel Hazo himself. So Adonis has a very early activism, starting at the age of 14, when he read a poem for the president. Their newly elected president was going around Syria to get to know his peoples, and he read a poem pushing for democracy in the country. The president was so moved by this that he sponsored his education going forward. When he got to college, he became associated with the Social Syrian Nationalist Party, which was a group of people who believed in uniting various countries in the Middle East to form a greater Syria. And he was the organizer of many of the student demonstrations for these. It was also during this time that he began using Adonis as a pseudonym, and this garnered a lot of controversy because it's a Greek myth, even though it took place in Lebanon. And a lot of people thought this was his way of rejecting all sorts of Middle Eastern heritage. After he was imprisoned, his activism became a lot quieter, and he became known as the father of modern Arabic poetry. His activism became almost completely in writing, as he wanted the Middle Eastern people to question the foundations of their problems, such as blind faith in religion, etc. While researching in the IPF archives, I discovered this limited edition pamphlet of Elegy in Exile, which was a poem that was not published in The Blood of Adonis, only the last 4 stanzas. And I think this item just offers a lot of questions. The fact that there's not too many in the world, only 200 copies were printed, leave people thinking.
Next up, we have Jalen Jones.
Hi, so the poet I chose is Father Daniel Berrigan. He's a Catholic priest. So Father Berrigan was born May 9th, 1921 in Virginia, Minnesota. Eventually his family, when he was fairly young, I think about 3 years old, they moved to Syracuse, New York. They had a farm. He's the 4th of 6 children. So he was born with weak knees. So a lot of the hard labor he didn't have to do. So he learned a lot of household chores and things with his mother. So he kind of got to see a softer side of life compared to his siblings. Um, so they were a Catholic family, but his father was pretty abusive to his mother. But despite the belief that the Catholic Church was in favor or endorsed the treatment of his mother, he still devoted his life to becoming a priest. So he earned a degree from St. Andrew on Hudson. It's a Jesuit seminary in Hyde Park, New York. He earned his master's from Woodstock College in Baltimore and was ordained in 1952, that same year. So he spent 3 years at the Jesuits Brooklyn Preparatory School teaching theology and French. And he was learning about Robert Frost, E. Cummings, and another Jesuit, Gerard Manley Hopkins. And he spent some time in France, about a year. And, his ideas were deemed fairly radical for the church at the time. He kind of had a reputation as a fire starter. And on October 23rd, 1968 is when he was invited here by Sam Hazo to read at the IPF. So what he's known for is the Catonsville Nine is a group of 9 activists who went to a selective service office in Catonsville, Maryland. So they went in, they assume it to be animal blood, but they seized draft records, poured blood on them so they would be ruined and unsalvageable. And they burned them with homemade napalm. His idea behind it was they were anti-war during the conflict in Vietnam. So they were attempting to protect young Americans from being drafted into a senseless war. So it was led by Father Berrigan and his brother Philip, who was also a priest. It was pretty huge in the media. So they were arrested and they had a trial that was pretty drawn out, and they actually published their own paper. And they were letting people know that the trial wasn't fair and was set up against them. But what inspired this for Father Berrigan is during the Tet Offensive, he and the historian Howard Zinn, who wrote a People's History of the United States, they arrived in Hanoi on a mission to free 3 prisoners of war. And while they were there, they got caught in bombings. For Father Berrigan, this experience changed his life as he was stuck there with Mr. Zinn and a lot of children. So for him, seeing children there and looking them in the face, it really made this conflict real for him, and realized that this had to be stopped and he had to take action. So he wrote a pretty famous poem as Children in the Shelter. So he described as Under the Rain of Fire. He mentioned seeing 2 siblings attempting to take care of each other. So, knowing this, it's kind of gave him, a sense of direction for his activism. The IPF archive object I chose is from the Duquesne Duke. It's a newspaper article. It's written about his reading. So the headline is Berrigan Magic Attracts Crowds to Poetry Forum. So this is 4 months after the Catonsville incident. And there's actually some concern about whether he would be able to make it there because they assumed that he might be in prison by then, but thankfully he made it. The reporter, Anne Scrivener, she was glowing the way she described him. And I had the privilege of listening to the recording myself, and it was amazing to hear the response he got. It was like 2 minutes of a standing ovation. They really responded to him with his humor, everything. It really connected, and the person who read after him, Ned O'Gorman, actually found it pretty intimidating as he felt he couldn't top it. So the article adds the human touches, what it was like to be around him. And they described his presence as boyish, but at the same time, he felt like one of them, but also an authority on things, and everyone believed what he said and was prepared to follow. So he really, as he stated, was his mission, galvanize young people and, started a pretty big revolution. So thank you.
Next, we have Sydney Edwards.
All right, hi guys, I'm back again. So my poet was Gwendolyn Brooks. And a little bit about her is she was born June 7th, 1917 in Topeka, Kansas, but she moved to Chicago shortly after. And if you ask her, she would say that she's a native to Chicago instead of Kansas. She began writing poetry as early as 11 years old and was published in American Childhood Magazine at the young age of 13. And in 1917, she officially became an activist in response to Scottsboro boys' trials in Alabama. I'll delve into more into that. In 1945, she published A Street in Bronzeville, which is her first collection of poetry. And then in 1949, she published her book, Annie Allen, it's a poetry book. And then in 1950, for the same work, she became the first African-American to win the Pulitzer Prize. And then 18 years later, on November 14th, 1968, she visited the International Poetry Forum. As for her activism, in 1937, when she was 20, she officially became an activist following the Scottsboro Boys' trial. For those of us who do not know what that is, the Scottsboro Boys were 9 boys in Alabama who were unfortunately killed after 2 white women accused them of sexual assault. And the perpetrators did not get a very good trial. They had a very biased trial. And her poetry mostly focuses on and reflected radical political conscientiousness and focused mainly on tackling racism, sexism, and economic deprivation. While Brooks was an activist who wrote on these topics, she actually did not view her poems as activism and did not like whenever her poems were called propaganda. And she also wrote most of this based on the world of Bronzeville and through a kitchenette window, which meaning that she wrote about daily instances of racism, microaggressions, and macroaggressions alike. And she even got the title in one of my sources called the Bard of Bronzeville. In an interview for the Christian Science Monitor, she states that she is writing about the human experience and that activism is a part of the human experience. As for my object, this is the poster that was used to advertise her reading. It's not exactly the typical poster you would imagine for a very well-known poet, but it's a rough charcoal drawing that can be mistakenly viewed as simple. This was a common critique of Brooks's poetry, was that it could be viewed as simple. However, it definitely was not simple, and it's something that you need to look deeper into. This represents her activism as part of the human experience. And it also uses different images to show Brooks's tendency to use personas in her poetry. And it does not conform to a traditional poster design. And this is an homage to Brooks's use of non-traditional poetic form. And it reminds the reader that activism can also come in Brooks's format as art representing human experience and not as a tool or weapon to use as propaganda.
Next, we have Katura, who's going to talk about Lucille Clifton.
Hello, everyone. My IPF author was Lucille Clifton. She was born in Depew, New York, but shortly after moved to Buffalo. She spent her adolescence with her family. She came from an impoverished family that her dad was a steel mill worker and her mother was a launderer, so they didn't have much. And she often described her family as maybe the only Black family in town. She actually never felt like she should produce her own work because she watched her own mother burn up her poetry pieces at the direction of her father, or I should say her father's disapproval upon publishing them. So a friend actually saw her work and submitted them to the YHYMHA, and you will have to forgive me, I completely forget what that acronym stands for right now, but to a Poetry Center Discovery Award. Upon winning that award, she was invited to a dinner where a author from, or a publicist from Random House looked at her pieces, and she was since discovered. She came to Pittsburgh and read at the International Poetry Forum in February of 1971, so shortly after the release of her first book. Over the course of her career, she published 30 volumes of poetry and novels, including the very popular Everett Anderson series for children. She's the first author to have been nominated as the Poetry Laureate of Maryland, and I think she has 2 works published for the Pulitzer Prize. And then she wanted to be remembered as a woman whose roots go back to Africa, who tried to honor being human, and who could do the best she could most of the time. She said, "My inclination is to help." So for Clifton, her activism came in the form of writing about her experience and the human experience as well, while acknowledging like her African-American culture and heritage. She crafted like deeply personal autobiographical poems that didn't leave out or skimp on any of the details of her personal hardships she endured in life, including sexual abuse she faced at the hands of her own father and her battle against cancer as she became older in age. She wrote that her poems centralized Black women's lives and explored the human capacity for love, rejuvenation, and transcendence over weakness and malevolence, even as they expose the myth of the American dream. And this last quote is something that I really love to hear. Viewed poetry as a human art. It's about being human, whatever gender or color or class. She was not just advocating for African-American culture. She was an activist for all of humanity. And I think that's why I really connected with this author a lot. For her IPF archive object, I selected a poem that she typed herself and submitted with a letter while in correspondence with the IPF as a sample of her work. It is in the inner city. Oh, let me back up real quick. The rest of the object has a signed letter and another simple poem, but I'm just gonna focus on this one today. So in the inner city was one of the poems that she remembers writing. She states that this poem is where she first found her voice, and she thought to herself, like, now this is what I sound like. This is me as a poet. So in addition to being the first one she remembers writing, it was the first one she presented when at the IPF, and it was the first one to open up that first book, Good Times.
Next, we have Maddie Longmore, who's going to talk about Adrienne Rich.
I had the pleasure of researching Adrienne Rich, and I'm Maddie Longmore. She was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1929. She was born to a Jewish family, which she feels really shaped her identity. Both of her parents were in academically enriching fields, which sparked her love of writing and reading. She graduated from Radcliffe University in 1951. She was selected by W.H. Auden for the Yale series of Younger Poets Prize for her piece, A Change of World, in the same year. She had 3 children with her husband, Alfred Conrad, and she said that the experience of motherhood was eventually to radicalize her. Rich felt the burden of motherhood left her with little time to write and less motivation because of all the homemaking and child rearing that fell on her shoulders. Her husband shot and killed himself in 1970, which was a really traumatizing event for the family, and she feels like really affected her. She eventually moved in with her long-term partner and began to identify as lesbian in a time that it was not accepted. She missed her 1969 reading at the IPF due to scheduling conflicts, but she was able to make an appearance on October 24th, 1973. She taught at several universities like Swarthmore, Columbia, and Brandeis University. Her activism, she wrote Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law, which explored women's roles, sexuality, and family dynamics during a time this was not widely talked about, spanned from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. She speaks about the derogatory terms often used against women like whore and shrew, which classify women's emotions and sexuality as negative. Her poetry centers around the female experience, gender-based violence, and the oppression women face for their sex. She published the essay Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, which challenged social norms and patriarchy. This spoke about women's compulsion to heterosexuality because society does not accept lesbianism or queerness. She identified as lesbian during a time that it was an act of revolution in and of itself. And in 1997, she refused the National Medal of the Arts Award given to her by Clinton's White House because she didn't believe that the White House was conducive with art, and she couldn't accept such a prestigious honor. For my IPF archive object, I chose a pamphlet from her 1973 reading. It's written by Sister Lynn Conroy, and it details all of her awards, like her publishing in the New Poets of England and America and contemporary American poetry. The first page, pictured on the right, also details A Change of World, The Diamond Cutters, and Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law. And the front cover is a drawing of Pittsburgh and features other authors. Thank you.
Next, we have Ashley Anderson talking about Muriel Rukeyser.
Hello, everyone. I had the honor and pleasure of working with Dr. King, first of all, and then also reading and learning about Muriel Rukeyser. So she was born in New York City on December 15th. She was a Sagittarius. She was born in 1913, where her father worked in the cement industry and actually helped supply a lot of the materials for New York City's buildings, which I found very interesting. She attended Vassar College and Columbia University in New York City. And that was where she first published her poems, her collection of poems in 1935. She was married but divorced. And then after the divorce, she had a child with someone that is unnamed. And after that, she had a few relations with some women. So she was bisexual. In 1971, she was arrested and detained for 4 days after a Vietnam protest. She laid on the ground in the Capitol and was arrested for some silly nonsense. And then she read at the International Poetry Forum on February 7th of 1972. So a lot of Muriel Rukeyser's activism was in her poetry, but she also, because she was a journalist at both universities, it enabled her to travel and write about the injustices that she saw. One time she went to Alabama in 1931 to cover the second Scottsboro trial that Sydney had talked about earlier. She was arrested there for fraternizing with an African-American student. I think she was arrested. I think she was in jail for just a few days. But then later in 1936, she was going to the Berlin Olympics to protest that. By the time she got there, the Spanish Civil War had begun, and it was a complete graveyard when she showed up. And then a few years after that, she visited West Virginia to research and interview victims of the silicosis outbreak, which was blamed on the poor working conditions that the miners experienced. Basically a lung disease that killed over 800 miners in West Virginia. And so all of these places that she visited really helped her write her writing and her poetry. And a lot of interesting things in the archive, but my favorite thing that we found was this article written by Nicholas Blatchford. And he's this really nice guy who talks about Muriel Rukeyser as somebody who has the toughness it will take to be imprisoned. So he kind of saw her like staunchy look and masculine manner, and just kind of recalled about what he knew about women, that most women are beautiful and exquisite and sensitive and whatever. And determined that Rukeyser was none of these things, and said that she would be great in prison. You're going to do a great job. You'll be fine. And she said, can't a woman be a mixture of both? Can a woman be exquisite and also very masculine? And the answer is yes. So thank you.
Next up, we have Malcolm Randall, who's going to talk about Kurt Vonnegut Jr.
Hi, everyone. I had the honor of doing Kurt Vonnegut, and he was born in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1922. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1943, and his most popular novel, Slaughterhouse Five, was based on his experience in World War II. After that, he pursued fiction full time, and he published a lot of short stories and a lot of novels right after that. He was most notably known as a writer, but as well as a socialist, a humanist, and very anti-war. His stance on anti-war was very noticeable in his novel Slaughterhouse Five. It was based on his experience in World War II when he was captured by the Germans in a slaughterhouse, and he was tortured, and he witnessed the firebombing of Dresden on February in 1945. After that, he saw the hellish and surreal landscape, which prompted him to write the novel and which contributed to his stance on anti-war. Yeah, but as well as being a writer, he was very socialist, very humanist. He shared his opinions and beliefs on things. He shared his worldview, which a lot of writers and fans of his admired as well, and it contributed well to his legacy. For my object, I chose this a poster and a pamphlet which advertised his reading on November 17th, 1971, and during that reading, it was very interesting because seeing as he didn't actually read any of his work, he just had opinions on matters as our human habits, the education system, politics, the environment, how we can make our plan better. He expressed his opinions very well, and people were laughing. They praised him after he did, and oddly enough, it was a sold-out gathering at Heinz Hall, and yeah.
Next up, we have Ed, who's going to be talking about Derek Walcott.
Hi, I'm Ed Simo. I picked Derek Walcott to research for the IPF archive, actually primarily because he's West Indian and I'm West Indian. So he was born in St. Lucia in Castries, and my mother's actually born in St. Vincent, which if you look at the map is the island just under. So learning more about that culture and that heritage was really a big thing for me as I was researching Derek Walcott and learning about his views on post-colonial West Indian culture. So he graduated from the University of Kingston, Jamaica in 1953. After that, he moved to Trinidad and founded the Trinidad Theater Workshop with his brother in 1959. He won an Obie Award in the US in 1971 for his play Dream on Monkey Mountain, which is a really big deal at the time. Played on national TV, everything. After that, he read at the International Poetry Forum a few times in 1971, actually 1972 and 1973. And later he became a professor at Boston University and founded the Boston Playwrights Theater in 1981. He won a Nobel Prize in Literature for his epic poem Omeros in 1992 and was knighted in 2016 as a member of the Order of St. Lucia, which was established as part of growing St. Lucian independence from Great Britain. And he passed in March 17, 2017. The overarching theme of Sir Walcott's work revolves around the realities of the post-colonial Caribbean, lacking that of the great powers of Europe. He often stressed the negative effects of colonialism on the diversity of culture, especially literature. He places a large emphasis on the need to create a new Caribbean identity, one defined by the current Caribbean people and all their heritage. He believes strongly that the cultural history of Great Britain belonged as much to the colonized as to the British. There's a small quote from his very long narrative poem, The Schooner Flight, there, which brings that in together. A mixing of not just ethnicities and cultures, but also the type of poetry that he's writing is often European styles with a Caribbean emphasis. What is it about? It's about something Caribbean. So the IPF archive that I picked is his essay, The Antilles Fragments of Epic Memory, which is a telling of an experience of witnessing this Indian play and event and a cultural memory while being very aware of the lack of such a thing in the broader Caribbean. He connects the shared heritage of the East and West Indies under European colonization, and he expresses a grief for the lack of similar contiguous West Indian tradition. What that really means is, if you're familiar with West Indian Day parades or something like that, then you might be familiar with Carnival and the very colorful, often including feathers and stuff like that, very bright blues, yellows, greens, and reds. And what is the meaning of that, though? Is something that Derek Walcott would absolutely want to get the hang over. When he's witnessing this play put on by this Indian tradition that also exists in the Caribbean and Trinidad, these gods have names. These gods have histories that these people know about and that they take part in and that they really experience. It's a matter of worship, not just this parade, not just anything like that. Thank you.
Next, we have Lee Butler, and she's going to talk about Yevgeny Yevtushenko.
Hi, I'm Lee Butler, and I had the pleasure to do Yevtushenko. Yevtushenko was born on July 18th in 1932 in Zima, Russia, which is on a small Trans-Siberian railway. He moved to Moscow in 1935 with his entire family, but unfortunately they had to evacuate back to Zima in 1941 due to World War II. Afterwards, he was able to move back and actually attended the Gorky Institute of World Literature as an adult. His parents divorced at age 7 and he resided with his mother. A lot of his early poems have described that experience, but his poems did not become known until after Joseph Stalin's death in 1953. He was married 4 times, but had 5 children, 2 of which were adopted. He remained married to Maria Navika, I believe it said as, and they remained married until 2017, whenever he died. He died in Tulsa, Oklahoma while teaching. The Khrushchev thaw was a time from the mid-1950s to 1960s after Joseph Stalin's death. He really took this as a time to talk about the oppression and rule of Stalin. He wrote Baby Yar, or Bobby Yar, as he said, in 1961 about a ravine where Nazis killed tens of thousands of Jewish in 1941. He also related that back to Russia and talked about anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. The next year, he wrote The Hairs of Stalin, which really discussed the oppression and the ruling of Joseph Stalin. He also made fun of neo-Stalinists in the line, "No wonder they suffer heart attacks," to talk about how they were out of touch with times. In 1966, he published Brack Station. This poem is one of his most famous ones, and it also relates back to Siberia, which is where his family was 4th-generation immigrants from. It talks about how Russian history sees Siberia as a prison versus how he sees it as a lighthouse. In 1968, my fault, he wrote a telegram protesting the Czechoslovakia-Warsaw Pact. And that is whenever Soviet Union invaded Prague, Czechoslovakia. He called it a mistake and a tragedy. In 1970, he really got involved in American politics and conflicts with Flowers and Bullets, where he made that in memory to Alison Krauss. She was one of 4 students at the Kent State University who was killed by National Gunsmen. He even involves a quote from her shortly before her death, which was, "Flowers are better than bullets." I picked 2 correspondence or letters for my IPF object. The one on the left is a letter from Mrs. MP Garfunkel, and she writes the day after Samuel Hazo's appearance in 1966 at the IPF. She expresses her appreciation and her enjoyment, but she also brings up a negative review from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and called it modest. She also includes the quote, "This poet's ability to communicate electrifies me." This is a very important quote because Yevgeny Yevtushenko only spoke Russian. He did not speak English. And in his reading, a few times he spoke in only Russian, and there was no translations for those poems, but yet everyone in the audience could understand him because, as Samuel Hazo said, he was dramatic and very expressive. Samuel Hazo writes back a few days later, and he also says a quote, "True, it is modest, and its thoroughness was remarkable since it was written by a man who did not even stay to hear the reading." This is very impactful to the IPF and also the Times because it was during the Cold War, and it's very much suspected that the reason why the writer left instead of listening to the reading, but yet gave such a negative review, is because he was Russian. Thank you.
Okay, at this time, we have the opportunity for our students to answer questions. And I would like to sort of have all of you come up here. Again, I want to say how groundbreaking and significant their research is. Come on up. We'll do some Q&A up here. I also strongly encourage everyone to go see the gallery exhibit called To Hear It With Our Eyes. In that exhibit, you can see some of the objects that the students analyzed. You can also hear some of the audio tape of these writers. And there's on the wall, there's some QR codes that you can scan and actually get access to the amazing essays written by each of these students. And for those essays, they had to not only learn about their writer, they had to do biographical research, they had to do contextual research to understand the writer's activism. They had to listen to the audio tape of the reading from the 60s or early 70s, analyze the reading, including audience reaction, and then they had to create an argument for an object to be highlighted in the show. So it was a big project. After they finished that, they then created gallery tags for archival items. So when you go to that exhibit, you'll actually see tags that they created. They really did. This is work that you would sort of expect more from graduate students. And in this class, we have everything from first-year students to seniors, and they just were phenomenal and really, really worked tremendously hard. Okay, so questions, comments, please. Don't make them stand up here. Yes.
So it seems like a lot of the readings were done, you know, from seems like Sam Hayes, from everything that I saw, the IPF hasn't really progressed much further. From your different walks of life, how can you envision yourselves as the next generation kind of getting this type of form for everyone else?
That's a very great question.
I think should I use the mic?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Can I though?
Yes, that'd be great.
So I think a big deal for me personally was seeing that this was happening in Pittsburgh. And as a, when you go to Carlow, you kind of hear like the nurses and stuff like that, and you don't really know the history of poetry here. And so to do this whole gallery and to learn about all these things is to know like this stuff happened in Pittsburgh, and now Carlow owns these archives. And so it's such a legacy for Carlow students and for Pittsburgh in general to have these things here. And it kind of sets a precedent to like, you can make history at any point in time. It doesn't have to be like during a war or during, I don't know, something else. But I think with the pandemic and everything, a lot, like in the last session, we have a lot of poems coming from the pandemic. And so I think time and place is really important. I don't know if that answered your question. Does anybody else?
Going off of what Ashley said about making history, whenever I found out about Yevgeny Yevtushenko, I really thought about how he spoke about Russia and the Soviet Union, anti-Semitism, and the Russian-Ukrainian war is going on right now. So as the next generation, for people to be able to relate history to current day and really use that in their lives, that's something I look forward to with this gallery.
I feel like coming from me and from my experience, especially since I had Gwendolyn Brooks, I actually think it made me become a better writer with just the way that she viewed poetry and how activism can be a part of the human experience. I feel like if you were here for my poetry reading, I feel like that's definitely reflected in my poems, and especially in response to current events. I definitely feel that taking into consideration what Lee and Ashley have said, this is something that can make people better writers and can kind of inspire people to put more of themselves into their work.
Who else would like to say something?
Yeah, so I'm currently the MC of the Red Dogs reading series here at Carlow. We invite poets, microfiction writers, things of that nature on to read for us and get that exposure out there. Students from Carlow, professionals from around the country, really. And as far as this generation goes, I mean, that's how I'm helping.
Anyone else? Maddie?
I think we feel a distance often from hard topics, and we think that they only happen during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. But with the war in Ukraine and reproductive health being up for debate constantly, I think it reminds us that we have to constantly fight for things. So yeah.
Anyone else? Good. Emmy?
I also kind of want to just say, I don't think this really ever ended. Perhaps the format of the IPF has ended, but there are so many other places in Pittsburgh, like City of Asylum, who are still highlighting writers' voices and social justice writers. It's just like we've evolved into a digital age.
Anyone else want to say anything? Okay, those were great responses and a fabulous question. Thank you so much. All right, other questions, comments? There's one, Michael.
So reading Derek Cott's work is absolutely one thing. He's a phenomenal writer, phenomenal poet. But hearing him speak at the IPF, his dry tone and delivery, and the way that some even humorous aspects of his poems just get delivered flat, just like that, I think really goes a lot into understanding the character of the poet. And it definitely does make me think about reading my own work whenever I'm trying to write something out more. I think the power of that is absolutely phenomenal. The power of the voice goes beyond the written word, and there's a reason that oral tradition is something that is kept alive in, I think, most cultures.
All right, so something typical to Gwendolyn Brooks is that her poems are very hard to read, but they're easy. They're a lot easier to be heard. And this is something that we've been actually talking about in one of Dr. Ash's classes, where we actually got to study a lot of her poetry. And a lot of like the comments was that we couldn't really understand it whenever it was read, but whenever we heard it being spoken by people, just like even in our class, we could kind of get like a better understanding, especially if it's typical to a person's own experience. And then getting the opportunity to actually hear her work be read out loud by her was such an immense privilege of mine, definitely. And I feel like I definitely adopted a lot of the way that she read with her own emotions and her own line delivery. I feel like it's definitely made me be a little bit more conscious about how I'm writing and how I am reading, and also how I'm speaking, especially when it comes to reading my own writing.
With Yevgeny Yevtushenko, a lot of his original writing was in Russian, and it was very hard to understand. But whenever I heard the audio recordings from the IPF, and I was able to actually hear, as Hazo said, his dramaticness, his just pure passion, or in some cases pain, and you could actually hear him crying whenever you hear him yelling, and you really just get a feel of everything that he has been through and that he has witnessed that you don't get through just reading.
Yeah, I think one of Sam Hazo's biggest selling points for the IPF was that this is something that normally you don't really hear recordings of a lot of these poets were before they were famous, before they won awards, before a lot of their fame. And so to have these, like we do that now with Red Dog and things like that, like we get to watch these young poets and young people who before they get big or whatever, we get to hear them. And I think a big deal, which I don't know if Sam understands like this impact that he's had, but the accessibility of these is like, it's hard to read poetry. But if I can sit down and if I can listen to it while I do my dishes, like that's great. And that's what I did, you know? And I listened to Daniel Berrigan's, I mean, seriously, just like 2 minutes of straight applause. And that really tells you a lot about the time period, what people in Pittsburgh thought of the Vietnam War, because he was there kind of in protest of it. And it just demonstrates, like, for Muriel Rukeyser, as a woman reading her poetry, I mean, she stood up there and people laughed at her jokes. I mean, she was taken very seriously. And, you know, I think you hear a lot about women reading in the 60s and you don't think that they have as much credibility, but they really do. And it's just shown me that like people are out there that really respect writers of all colors and, you know, sexes and whatever. And I just really enjoy the accessibility of it. And I think that it's so important that we have that.
When it comes to the difference between written word and spoken word, I felt that when studying Lucille Clifton, finally getting to listen to her IPF recording really connected me with her as an author, and I really felt the emotion behind all those words. And when it comes to my own writing, I wish I could say it felt different when I was speaking it out loud versus reading it. So I hope that although I may not be able to pick on it myself, in the future, others listening to me read it do.
So for the latter part of the question, I feel like that merits more thought for me personally. For the first part, I really was struck when Father Berrigan was reading is, you know, in terms of the bombings, like a lot of his poetry had that imagery in there. And you could hear he sounded kind of haunted at some parts. But I love the little sidebars and stories that you hear that you can't interpret yourself when you just read it. Like a quote that stuck out to me is he mentioned that I've been upset since Hiroshima was the quote he said. You see, you know, the scars of World War II were still lingering with him and, you know, fresh in his mind. And I guess there's still the Korean War in the 50s that's still, you know, looming over the country. Just even like, yeah, his jokes here and there. And like it adds the human touches that make it come alive and make you want to get invested. And then, you know, it comes alive in a way that, you know, just reading it and interpreting on your own really can't match.
Anyone else want to comment on that great question of the experience of listening to your poet as opposed to reading, or your writer? I know I keep saying poet, Malcolm. I know you've got the fiction writer, Kurt Vonnegut. Anyone else have anything for that question? Emmy, great.
So my poet was Adonis, and during his readings, Samuel Hazo typically read the English translation first, followed by Adonis reading in the original Arabic. But halfway through the program, Samuel Hazo said something. I don't have the direct quote memorized, but he said that he acknowledges that it's hard to listen to another language with comprehension, but if you listen to it with the ear of feeling, then you'll get all the messages the same way. And the listening to Adonis read like that was very eye-opening, because until this class, I've honestly never read poetry or listened to it orally. It was just, I thought that quote was really profound.
That's wonderful, Emmy. Thank you so much. We have 5 minutes left. Does anyone else have a question or comment? Yes.
maybe in the style of the writer or write about some themes that this writer wrote about, or after hearing them read, have that inspired. So I'm curious, just if any of you are feeling that very labor intensive work in getting out of this.
Yeah, I love Adrienne Rich. She's hello. Okay. She talks a lot about the female experience, and she has all of her writing is feminist. I consider myself a feminist writer as well. She, man, she also has just dealt so much. She was such an introspective person throughout her whole life, and kind of cultivated her identity, and you can see that through her writing. And I'd like to think of the same of myself. Not as grand or as amazing, but yeah, I this research project has really brought me closer to another writer. So yeah.
So Derek Walcott's Nobel Prize winning poem, The Omeros, is based on, or not based on, I'm sorry, but in the same style as any Greek epic, right? It's based on the Odyssey. And I honestly thought of those like ancient Greek literatures as kind of untouchable by this point. And then here Derek Walcott is 91 winning an award for writing something just like that. And the style that he writes, the type of prose that he does, and like how dense it is. Yeah, I want to write just like that.
I'd say for me with Father Berrigan is I really love that he used faith as his compass, even when he himself was really downtrodden, that he had this fire within him that kept pushing him. I love that the older he got, he never ceased like his actions. Like in the 80s, he and his brother were like dismantling warheads. Like 2005, he's like 80 years old and he's blocking, I think, like the Naval Museum at the entrance. Like gets arrested for that. So I love that the work never stopped for him, or it wasn't like a job or something he did to get famous. Is something that meant a lot to him. Like when he got introduced at the poetry reading, Sister Carita was her name, but she said that Dan inspires us all to be a bit more human. And when he mentioned inspiring young people, which was his goal, is like he never wanted them to imitate him or be as radical or as transformational. He just wanted them to help in their own ways. He recognized not everyone can, do the stuff that he and his brother were able to do, but everyone can help in their own ways.
I definitely think that this has helped me like become a better writer, because Gwendolyn Brooks has a massive tendency to adopt different personas in her writing. And a lot of it is based off of what she has seen growing up in Bronzeville, or looking out a kitchenette window. She mentioned that a lot in her reading, by the way. So I figured I should say kitchenette window a lot. I really like the idea that she wrote about human experience and how different everyone is, even just on her own street, or from like any different perspective or any different persona that she's written from. And one of my favorite poems of hers actually was written after Emmett Till has been unfortunately lynched. And she wrote from the perspective of the woman who accused him of sexual assault and was the reason why he was unfortunately killed. And that really inspired me to try and see different perspectives in my writing and try to look at different perspectives as well.
Would anyone else like to say anything? Oh, yes, I think, who is it, Maddie? Emmy, yes.
If we're talking about like how we picked our poet, my background is actually not in English. I have an art background, and in the arts, I'm like absolutely obsessed with Sumerian art, Mesopotamian, Arabic art. So picking Adonis was really just a chance to jump into Arabic literature, which I have never done before. And rather than influencing my writing, I think it's given me a great starting point for studying more Arabic literature on top of the art.
Looks like we just got a wave. I think we did. So
Dr. King is so wonderful. And I just want to say something real quick. When I was doing my interviews for my documentary thing that I made for the IPF gallery, everybody I interviewed, we always started with how much we love Dr. King and how much you work so hard. And you're a Virgo, and I and I'm a Virgo. And so I just feel very inspired by you and the things that you've been through this semester. And we didn't get you a present or anything, but we really thank you. And we're so happy. And we don't know any other professor that could have done this and us feel so comfortable. We don't know what we're doing. And you did such a good job of helping us and literally like always being that half a step ahead. And that was so like, that was miles for us. Thank you.
I just want to say my heart is full of joy, full of tremendous admiration and respect for what you all accomplished this semester, and love you and am so proud of you. So thank you all, everyone, for coming. And go see the exhibit, because also in addition to Ashley's film, Caitlin's interview with Sam Hazo is featured, and they both, the video work that the two of them did is absolutely astonishing. Wonderful videos. And can everyone involved in the project stick here for a minute? Let's take some photos.